following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
My baby dolls, we are back again, another episode of Genesis. As always, I'm your host, Ian Kahanowitz. Today, another stellar show on baseball, folks. We got Lou Hernandez returning to the show. And, my heart warms when anyone returns to this show. It must mean I'm doing something right. Of course, we had Lou on last month with those 33 Giants. And, of course, we learned a lot about the whole torch passing from John McGraw onward. And we saw what a great season, what a great book that was. Today, we have baseball's Great Hispanic Pitchers, 17 aces from the major Negro and Latin American leagues. Now, when you talk about the Latin and Negro leagues, you're talking about my areas of study that I have done the last 4 to 5 years, including dead ball era. Of course, most of you know I have the Negro League sites on Facebook, and I always, throw in the Clementes, and I throw in the Martin Higos in there, and people who have, played and had made an impact, not only in the Negro leagues, but also in the Mexican leagues and the Cuban leagues and the Dominican leagues, and we're going to get into all that. We're going to see how it impacted baseball, especially in the mid to late 50s, the whole era of the 60s and 70s, and, of course, today we have a majority of our players, I think, are being imported because they have mastered the great American sport. But before I even get to things and get to our stellar show, you are listening to the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network with the Zigzag Man, Ralph Tycho himself. We have great shows. We got Goldenbach University. We got Mark and Mark in the midday. We got Oakland A's baseball, New York, San Francisco Giants baseball going back to the beginning of the American and National Leagues. We have such great shows on. I cannot begin to tell you. Philadelphia baseball, Dodger baseball, New York Yankee baseball, Met baseball. We have it all here. And, of course, I'm honored to do a show with Dave Nemec and Alan Blumpkin, and Dave Nemec's old-time baseball and trivia. And, of course, Dave was the author of many trivia books back in the 70s and 80s, and he was the official biographer of Dr. Alger Hiss, who was his family's own physician right before the whole communist accusations took place in the 1950s. So to speak with him, to speak with anyone who has written these fantastic things which we all learn from, I'm really blessed to do so. And I'm even more blessed here because Latin baseball has always been a passion of mine. Orlando Hernandez, Louis Tiant. I remember Louis on Boston. I don't go back to Cleveland. I don't go back to 1960 when he saw. But I remember when he was traded to the Yankees, man. I was like, yeah, this is great. We just won 2 world championships. We're getting Louis Tiant. And unfortunately, Thurman Munson died that season of 79, but I used to love that guy's wind-up, and I had the luxury of meeting Louis up here at Fenway Park, I think about 10 years ago. Loved it. I loved that his father, who also pitched, was in the 1975 World Series. And I love that picture. The pictures in this book, and there's pictures all over the Internet. And you know something? Louis Tiant Sr., he has slacks on, he has shoes, a dapper man, It's so awesome to see all this customs and, all culture and what the Latin players have brought. But I do want to plug for Lou's 2 books that have been previously done by McFarland, Memoirs of Winter Ball, interviews with players in the Latin American Winter Leagues of the 1950s, and, hey, another important historical book here, The Rise of the Latin American Baseball Leagues, 1947 and 1961, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Mexico, Nicaragua, Panama, Puerto Rico, and Venezuela. And, of course, they were his previous 2 books on Latin baseball. And they're a must-read, folks. I mean, this is great stuff that we're dealing with. And, of course, Lou is a member of the Society for American Baseball Research, or better known as SABR, a lifelong baseball fan and he has the good fortune of living in Florida while I'm freezing up here in Boston. Welcome to the show, Lou.
Hi, Ian. How are you? I'm pleased to be with you again.
Oh, every day I pick up one of your books, and it's like, wow, I never do this, you know? And if you could stop me and you could teach me something, it's an honor to be here with you, sir. Latin American ball in the Caribbean, ball in Mexico, ball in Cuba, the islands. Tell us a little bit how it got started in interest.
Well, I've always been, as you touched on, a lifelong baseball fan, and being Hispanic myself, I was born in Cuba. Since a little boy, I grew up loving the game. You know, it was the game of my father. It's the story of everybody, most everyone who follows the game and has followed it for many years. And naturally, of course, I leaned toward Hispanic players and following them, you know, a little bit more closely than other players, North American players. But, you know, with baseball, it's there's no prejudice involved. You just have your great players, and you just admire their abilities and their accomplishments and the way they comport themselves on the field. And that's basically, you know, how it started from a very young age. And fortunately, the last few years, I've been able to reflect on those many decades of watching baseball and being able to put them to print form and trying to share my passion with so many other great baseball fans around the world.
You do a hell of a job. Let me ask you this. Were you born under the Batista regime or you were born under Castro?
I was born in 1958, so it was Batista, just a year before the Cuban Revolution. Because
one of the things I know, and I've had the good fortune of speaking with Gabe Paul's daughters and their sons and the whole Cincinnati Reds, you know, he basically made the Havana sugarcane team. And my question to you is this. In Latin America, in the Caribbean, you know, why were these countries so interested in what is dubbed the American pastime?
I think just the interest spawned, I guess, originally in the 19th century when the game was first exported to Cuba from the U.S. and then from Cuba it was exported to other countries, Puerto Rico, Venezuela, the Dominican Republic. And as far as why they chose baseball, I don't know. I know there's a lot of countries in South America that the national sport is soccer. So I just happened to, it just is one of those things. It's culturally, I don't know, indigenous to their countries. It's just, I think it shows a good reflection on the game itself that you mentioned earlier how globalized the game has become, and you know, it just started in our backyard here. Of course, Canada has the longest history with the game as well, so it just spawned here on the North American continent and has gone into the Eastern Hemisphere, Western Hemisphere. So it's just a great game. It just I think it just shows a lot of how good the game is.
And you know something. By my understanding, as football or soccer, I mean, look, Brazil, Argentina, Europe, Asia, they call it the beautiful game. Okay? That's their national sport. That's probably about, I'd say, 5/6 of the world's national sport. And I was fortunate to do an interview, and I had a translator from Italy. There's a very small baseball league. I mean, it's, you know, like soccer in America now. It's like baseball in Italy. It's like the 4th or 5th major sport. And the passion that goes in what they call the Tomato League is unbelievable. That when I interviewed these folks that play in the Tomato League, the next day they were sending me news clippings through my email and stuff that I had made the papers with the interview. And so it was great. Rome and all these places had my interview with them. And it just took me by surprise. But I think, you know something, Lou, I think the Hispanic leagues are just as important in scope as the Negro leagues. And if integration came a lot before, say, 1947 with Jackie Robinson, of course, in the mid-50s with Clemente and Orlando Zapata and the Lou brothers and Juan Marichal and, and all those folks that are coming through, I think there would be a better appreciation of how important these leagues were. What's your take on that?
Yeah, that's a good point. Certainly, the leagues were important to the countries themselves. That's pretty clear if you study the writers of those countries and the players of those countries. But yeah, it is important, as you said, and books like what I try to do is I try to also inform, the North American audience, so to speak, of how many great players there were in the Latin American leagues and how important it was to the people during those, that particular period of baseball's development in those different countries. So yeah, it's to the leagues, to the countries themselves. Baseball was very, very important. It had a place in society and even in the social consciousness of many of the countries. It was an annual thing. It's a ritual, just like it is here, and very important to each country. The game of baseball was. Yes.
Let me ask you this question: you pick out 17. Pitchers here. When you call them aces, was it a difficult, process of like gathering, say, 50 of these guys who had pitched, whether it's in the Negro leagues or the Latin leagues or the United States and the Major League Baseball? Was it difficult to make your choices here?
Yeah, it was, and because of that, I ended up using a criteria of wins. I chose pitchers that won 200 games or more in either the major, minors, Latin American leagues, Negro leagues combined. So if you won over 200 games, you were the pitcher spotlighted in the book. Although there are other pitchers mentioned in the book at the end, where I have a list of the all-time greats that I feel that were the all-time great Hispanic pitchers. And some of those pitchers, just because of longevity or length of career, didn't reach the criteria. But to answer your question, the criteria was wins. I know that's not something that's looked on or nowadays with the sabermetrics and everything. It's not the biggest pitching yardstick, but wins is what my criteria was to choose these players, these pitchers.
I think you did a good job. And let me just say something. I had shows on sabermetrics and the whole war and all these things. And let me tell you something. I'm not totally sold on sabermetrics. I think it's one of many useful tools. Unfortunately, in the game today, it's probably the only tool to roll the numbers and stuff. But we're going back. I mean, come on. Right here, Ramon El Profesor Bragana. Oh, by the way, did I say that correctly?
Yeah, perfect.
You know why? Let me just say something so I can like impress you a little bit. And my vocabulary is probably out of whack, but I'll say it on the air. Yo sabe un poco de español porque yo tomo español en mi escuela por 5 años y yo vive en la ciudad de Nueva York por 23 años y muchas personas hablan español. So,
muy bien.
So I know a little Spanish.
You put sentences together. That's really a good comprehensive of any language.
Yeah, well, I've had a whole thing, but people don't know about Ramon Bragana, and we're talking about a 27-year career. What are some of the highlights we could talk about, Mr. Bragana?
Bragana was a Cuban-born pitcher. He's a right-hander. He spent his time in the international leagues, and when I say that, I mean the Cuban Winter Leagues, the North American Negro Leagues. He pitched in the Dominican Republic, and he really made his biggest name pitching in Mexico. That's where he made his biggest mark. He won over 200 games in the Mexican League, which was a summer league, and out of those 200 wins, there was a 30-win campaign in 1944. He pitched into his 40s. He's credited with winning over 300 games. So we were talking about wins earlier. He's credited with winning over 300 games in his entire international league career. And he was elected to, not surprisingly, the Hall of Fame in Mexico and in Cuba. And like a lot of Cuban black athletes at the time, he embraced Mexico because he felt, this is on a social note, he felt a greater freedom for black athletes in Mexico. And he actually married a Mexican woman and settled down in Mexico, raised a family there, and then he passed away in Mexico at the age of 76.
Now, he was old, though, when he got married. He has gray hairs, and his wife looked really young there in your picture.
Yeah, possibly.
I'm like, hey, this guy's lucky, you know? I think he is probably one of the pioneers when you look at this, as well as Martin Dihigo, who probably has a little bit more notoriety, because he was multi-positional. He was primarily a pitcher, but he also was a second baseman. He grew up, I know, in Cuba, but what people don't understand is games weren't recorded usually in the Negro leagues or in the Latin leagues. It is very difficult to do a yardstick. But let's talk about the impact of Martin Dihigo and what he had done.
Yes, Martin Dihigo, as you mentioned, was born in Cuba, and he was one of the most versatile players that ever played the game. He was a tremendous athlete. In fact, he looked the role of the athlete. He was 6'1", 180 pounds, and as I said, he was a versatile player. He played every diamond position, but as you mentioned, he was best known as a pitcher. He pitched. He was a contemporary of Bragana, although he was a few years older. He pitched. Dihigo pitched in the Negro leagues. He pitched in Venezuela, and he pitched in Cuba, of course. In fact, he still owns the record for most wins by a Cuban pitcher in the Cuban Winter League. Won 107 games in his career. I think that's about one more than Adolfo Luque did, so he edged out Luque there. He was chosen to the Hall of Fame, the U.S. Hall of Fame in 1977 through the Negro Leagues Committee, which was very magnanimous of them to bring in Hispanic players. And Dihigo was one of the players that was elected that year. He actually was elected. You mentioned second base. He was actually elected as a second baseman. So that just further proves his versatility. He's one of the few people that are elected into 4 different halls of fame: Cuba, Mexico, the United States, and the Dominican Republic. A lot of times you'll read that Venezuela, he was elected into the Hall of Fame there, like they'll say 5 different halls of fame, but it's actually 4. He was never elected into Venezuela's Hall of Fame. He only pitched there 4 years. I know Roberto Gonzalez Echeverria, he's the author of Pride of Havana, a history of the Cuban Winter League. He had some really nice things to say about Dihigo. I jotted a few things down here in case you would ask me. And he wrote about Dihigo, he had grace. His blend of style, dignity, and elegance was apparently unique. And Dihigo also possessed leadership qualities. He was personable, well-spoken, and had a sense of humor. He was a sharp dresser, and he became the first Cuban ball player to become a sportscaster after retiring. So, and he closes by saying he had something else difficult to describe, an intangible trait associated with bullfighting, a sport in which there are no numerical records to evaluate an individual. Again, he mentions the grace aspect. So he was a great player to watch, and he was duly recognized by his peers later on in life.
And you know what? You know what's the sad part? The part is, it always gets to me here. He died 5 days before his 65th birthday. And he was elected many years after he retired in 1977. But we don't know about Martin Diego, and let me just read off some stats here. From the Negro Leagues, he played 12 seasons in the Negro Leagues, and whatever they were able to record on the major teams here, he had a batting average of .307, a .511 slugging percentage, 431 hits, 64 home runs, 61 doubles, 17 triples, 227 ribbies, and 292 runs scored in 1,404 at-bats. He drew 143 walks and stole 41 bases. As a pitcher, he went 26-19 with a 2.92 ERA, 176 strikeouts, 80 walks in 354 innings. This guy was an all-around player.
Yeah, definitely. That just shows, it just further accentuates his versatility and his status as one of the best players of all time.
And you know something? His greatest season came in the Mexican League in 1938. I think he was on back in. I think he did time both between Mariano in the Cuban leagues and the Azules de Veracruz in the Mexican League. But listen to this: 18-2 with a .900 ERA as a pitcher, while winning the batting title with 387 average. In another season in the Mexican League, he had a 0.15 ERA. In his Mexican career, he was 119.57 with a 317 batting average. In the Cuban League, he was 107.56 with a 298 average. It's unbelievable.
The ERA is especially telling in Mexico because you're pitching at high altitude there with the thin air, and you know how the ball travels. So that's a quite telling statistics with the ERA in Mexico and the success he had in Mexico. You're right.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. And this is, and you know what, Lou, this is why books like yours educate, because we are so used to having ESPN and Sports Channel. No one picks up a newspaper to read this anymore. I don't even have to go to cable. I get all my alerts on my cell phone, my smartphone. There's no point to read a box score. People don't even read books anymore because we've all become dependent on our cell phones, and even computers are going away. But this is reasons why, I think Diego is one of the prime examples that a study into cultural baseball, whether it be Latin, Negro, women's, is important. I think he is the definitive example of what it took, what kind of talent it took, and what kind of hard work it took to achieve that feat. And it really is, if you're into all this stuff, a feat. Now, I go to your man over here, man who inspired you to write the 33 Giants, Dolph Luque, who I did not know, even when I was talking to you. He was on the 1919 Reds with the whole Black Sox thing.
Yeah, he was. And in that World Series, he became the first Latin American pitcher to appear in a World Series game. He had a good record in the World Series. He just fell short of 10 innings pitched. Never gave up a run. But, yeah, he was part of that 1919 team. He hadn't become a regular starting component with the Cincinnati Reds. That came in 1920, but the decade of the 1920s with Cincinnati, those were his peak years, and that's where he made his mark in the major leagues.
Let me ask you something, because I'm trying to get a few people into the Hall of Fame. You talk about, say, Gil Hodges. I speak to his family, his daughters and son. And I speak to Gabe Paul, who was very instrumental in orchestrating a huge influx of what was then minorities, African Americans, Latinos. He did more for the minorities than Branch Rickey did. Branch Rickey opened the door, but Gabe Paul actually expanded and made Latin American teams part of the Cincinnati minor leagues system, farm systems, where he literally took up players from there. And that was so instrumental just to Cincinnati and for the influx of money and interest into Latin American baseball. But, golf doesn't get enough credibility. And although his numbers would not be Hall of Fame numbers, I know he was a great manager. He managed a Havana Cubans in the Florida League. He did 2 stints with the Aguillas de Mexicali in 1950 at the Sunset League, Southwest International Leagues. Should he be put into the Hall of Fame?
I think, like you said, his numbers fall short. So he would probably go, I'm trying to later on advocate maybe like a international Hall of Fame wing, similar to what they have for sports writers. I think if the Hall of Fame did that, I think that would really be great. It would be a way of recognizing players not only in the Latin American leagues, but in Japan and places like that, Korea, where we don't know they're great players like we do our own players, or even players closer like in the Latin American leagues. If there was an international wing of the Hall of Fame, Sadahara O could be elected there for one, and we could put Adolfo Luca in, I think. We could put a couple of other maybe executives in there that have a place that would be deserving of recognition. Baseball has become so globalized now, and I think we have to recognize that globalization and start by doing it by recognizing individuals of the different countries that have been instrumental in promoting baseball and its progress throughout the decades. So that's where I view Luca as something as part of an international Hall of Fame league that hopefully Cooperstown in the not too distant future can start considering.
It's tough because Major League Baseball has a way of somehow blacklisting other leagues. And one of the leagues that they did blacklist was the International League. And I did a podcast on the first 300 game winner, Pud Galvin. He has 300 and I think 51 wins, and he was the first 300 game winner. But they don't count 50 games from his stint in the International League because they don't recognize it. It was what was called an outlaw league. Now, we shifted to the late 40s, and a lot of people don't know about, Happy Chandler comes in as commissioner. I've done an intense study for my book on Kennesaw Mountain Landis, the first commissioner. What I'm finding is he was not a racist, but, the Depression came. He needed gate receipts, and during that time period, he did not want to offend the owners by bringing in Latin Americans, African Americans, and so he did not talk about these things. Today he gets a bad rap for it, but what's even worse was, yes, integration happened under Happy Chandler, but now you got Mr. Pasquale in the Mexican League over there. And he's taken players from the Negro leagues. He's taken players from the Major League Baseballs. And there's no reserve clauses down in Mexico. And Happy Chandler's like anyone who goes down there is going to be banned from baseball for 2 years. How do you think that's going to work when we come and we have to examine that time period where Major League Baseball actually did shun the Mexican League?
Yeah, well, obviously history should always be exposed, whether it's good or bad, but we can learn from the bad part of it. Chandler's decree, I think, originally banned everybody for indefinitely, then it was 5 years, and then eventually, once organized baseball ended up signing all the winter leagues and left Mexico basically isolated, because they didn't have any more pipelines to bring in players. Once that happened, then all the former players that had jumped their leagues to play in Mexico, they were all pardoned. So as far as Chandler, and he was, I don't know, a great deal about him. I know he was a commissioner at the time where baseball made a great leap forward. And he did what he thought he had to do to protect his league and basically the owners and their reserve clause, which was pretty indenturing of any major league player. You were basically, once you signed a contract, you were theirs. You were that team's property for life unless that team decided to let you go. Yeah, you mentioned Jorge Pascal. He was quite a guy. I profile him in my Latin American leagues book, and that we talked about International Hall of Fame wing. He might be one that really might deserve consideration because he challenged the reserve clause, and it was baseball's first great challenge since the Federal League, and it was a challenge that eventually was beaten back. But as a result, major league players actually gained quite a bit of things from Pascal's challenge. So, baseball just has a wonderful history, and it's just threaded so much through the Latin American leagues and through Hispanic players, and it's just reflective of today where we are, where we have so many different players from different countries playing at the highest level.
Let me ask you this question. When you were researching your material in, the Latin American leagues, I know the Negro leagues used to have barnstorming engagements with Major League Baseball players, and they used to be, the Major League Baseball All-Stars versus the Negro League All-Stars. Did you comment across any of that with the Latin American countries?
As far as barnstorming, I didn't. You're talking about where maybe Major League players ended up going to other countries in Latin American play? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, like they would go and play the Cuban national team, or they go down to Mexico and play the Mexican All-Stars.
Yeah, there were instances of that. The most famous one I can recall was John McGraw taking the New York Giants down to Cuba back in, I guess it was 1920, and Babe Ruth actually accompanied him on that tour, even though McGraw didn't go with the team. He left the team in charge of two of his coaches, but Babe Ruth ended up playing with the Giants team, although it wasn't all Giants. They had other North American players playing down there, but I think that is the most famous barnstorm trip into Latin America. I know the Philadelphia Athletics went into Mexico, played there. The Cincinnati Reds went to Puerto Rico in 1937, I believe. That was the first time a U.S. team had gone to Puerto Rico. So, yeah, there were instances, but it was basically, I think, trying to promote the U.S. game in those countries. As far as actual team going to, like, other countries, to the U.S., no, but Cuba played a lot of games in Puerto Rico. They went to Venezuela. They did have interaction among the Latin American countries, maybe not so much in coming to the U.S., but they did have interactions within countries of the Caribbean basin, I should say.
And, I read umpire Doug Harvey's book, and he was a Major League umpire from 1962 to 1992 for 30 years. He's the one that handed Clemente his 3,000th hit ball back in 1972 at Shea Stadium. And Harvey goes on, and he began his career in the early 60s. And one of the things that elevated him, and I love it, was that he went down to Puerto Rico to umpire. And he really learned a lot down there with the Puerto Rican League. But this I loved. There was a riot in the stadium where he was umpiring that day, and people were getting hurt. He had to literally get the players off the field and himself to run because I think one of his crew people blew a call that costed the game. And the riots were just the passion that, and it's almost like a soccer match. The nets go up and all that. The fans are rioting. But he said, and he's still alive, Doug Harvey, he's nearing 90, he said, I learned the most in the Puerto Rican League. So this is early 1960s. Okay? Problem I have with these countries, and we'll talk about Juan Marichal and the whole Dominican Republic and the dictator at home and how he used Marichal and how there was a revolution and, the whole Roseboro thing. But one of the things are more contemporary, and of course we all knew this, who followed the Yankees, was Orlando Hernandez, El Duque from Cuba. What was going on with him? Why was he punished and could not play for the Cuban national team?
Simply because he wanted to better himself. He wanted to play baseball at the highest level. And once the Cuban government found that out, they just suspended him from his team, Industriales, which is a Havana-based team. And that decision really shocked the whole country. I read a book on El Duque. He had a biography written about him. The Duke of Havana came out a few years ago, and there's a passage in the book that says that the suspension of El Duque in Cuba, which happens to occur right before the big national series was going to be played to crown a champion. They have sort of a postseason playoff like we do. Maybe a few more teams are included. And that suspension came down right before that. And the author of the biography, he basically said that that was the equivalent, the suspension of El Duque was the equivalent of, would have been the equivalent of the Yankees suspending Derek Jeter right before the playoffs. That's how big a bombshell that was. But El Duque was able to leave Cuba and make it to the United States, and of course he had a very fine career with the Yankees. He had some great seasons. He was a right-handed pitcher, and he had a distinctive, what I call contortionist like leg kick, where he brought his knee basically up to his chin before he delivered the pitch. And side note about him, he ended up being the Hispanic pitcher with the most postseason wins to this day. He won 9 games in the postseason, and that's a record for Hispanic pitchers.
And all these guys, Juan Marichal had a distinct wind-up. Louis Tiant, I'll never forget, he had that hesitation on the back foot. He hesitated for that 1 second and then threw at least 11. There's Louis Tiant, he's pitching. Let's talk about Juan Marichal, because Juan Marichal is one of my favorite, baseball players. I think, we spoke about it in the 33 show. I think he doesn't get the credit he deserves. I don't know whether it's over the Roseboro fight. I don't know if Koufax overshadowed him for the 6 years in the 60s. But Marichal, I do have 2 things to advocate for him. One is he was the most winningest pitcher in the 1960s. And number 2 is I read his autobiography, and he always said, I am not like Sandy Koufax. I do not strike out people. Why do I need to get a batter out with 3 strikes when I can get a batter out with 1 strike? What's your take on this?
Yeah, well, Marichal, I mentioned earlier that I have a list at the end of the book of the greatest of all time, and he's number 1 on the list. He had incredible numbers. He's a deserving Hall of Fame inductee. He had 244 complete games. I mean, not wins, not games started, 244 complete games. I mean, try to wrap your head around that in today's Major League pitching world where if a pitcher goes 6 innings, it's considered a great effort. Marichal in 1967, he became the first Hispanic pitcher to earn 6 figures, 100,000. So that was a big threshold he was able to knock down. His ERA lifetime is 2.89, 52 shutouts. That's most by any Hispanic pitcher in Major League history. He won 243 games, which for a long time was a record. Dennis Martinez, before he retired, ended up winning one more. So Martinez took that record. Marichal debuted in the Major Leagues July 19, 1960, and he threw a one-hitter against the Philadelphia Phillies at Candlestick Park. So the accolades are all there. The numbers are all there. I mean, he's number one on my list, right above Pedro. So he was, in my opinion, the greatest Latin American pitcher of all time.
Now let's talk about Pedro Martinez for a second here. Little guy, okay? I always remember Pedro as being a little guy. You know, he's small, but the fire in him, which I saw when he was a teammate of Randy Johnson on the Montreal Expo, was unprecedented. Let's talk about Pedro a little bit.
Yeah, if you see any of his early photos or early videos of Pedro, he was a wispy, thin right-hander, but somehow with that slim frame, he was able to throw the ball very, very hard, and he developed into one of the greatest pitchers of all time, not just Hispanic pitchers. He had an incredible fastball, and I guess his big pitch was his changeup. He was able to really throw that pitch the same way as his fastball, and he had a decent slider and a decent curveball, but that changeup was his out pitch, and he just was a dominant pitcher in his day. He had the most strikeouts of any Hispanic pitcher. He struck out 3,154 batters in 2,800 innings. Again, he came along during the period where I guess the complete games weren't viewed as something important. He only had 46 out of 409 games started. Again, because of that, only 17 shutouts. But anything else, I mean, you look at his winning percentage. He was one of the few pitchers ever to win, 100 games more than you lost. I know Tom Seaver did that. Marichal, of course, did that. Very few pitchers have ever won 100 more games than they lost. That's quite an achievement. Sabermetric numbers, he had the best ERA plus of any Hispanic pitcher, 154. He was there. I mean, he's just number 2 on my list. One of the greatest of all time, definitely.
And he really rightfully deserves his place in the Hall of Fame. And of course, like Big Papi was, he's a great ambassador to the Dominican. I mean, it's just one of those things where, your career takes off, you become a kind of a spokesperson for the country you were in. And I think both these guys for what they did. Now, let me ask you this question. The whole steroid thing here in America. We went through the steroid era with Bud Selig and all this other stuff. Does these nations currently, or in the past, use performance-enhancing drugs because it's so difficult to get ahead of the competition, because it is competition, to try to land a major league deal? What has your research showed?
Well, as far as whether they try when they're young, that could be. I have no proof or no statistics that happens. Obviously, there's tight controls once a player is signed by a major league team, and those controls are pretty stringent nowadays. Again, you mentioned the steroids era. That's in the past, but before, I think just to try and get an advantage, it was very tempting. And if you're someone, with not a lot of education, or signed at a young age, maybe you don't realize the ramifications later on in life. It's possible, but again, there's no data that supports, saying that one country, maybe systematically pointed their players to try to get an advantage by using these drugs. Again, they would have had to cost money too, and a lot of the players didn't have that capability of spending money to enhance their performance. I think that really came about or comes into play in the minor leagues. I think the players there, once they come from whatever country they come from, when they get to the minor leagues here in the U.S., I think the temptation there is more, or certainly the availability is more prevalent, and the temptation therefore greater. But as far as the individual clubs and countries, it's hard to say, really. All we can say is that right now the controls are really stringent, and it seems to have weeded out the performance enhancing and the skewering of the numbers that were so prevalent at the turn of the century.
Now we go from being juiced up to being beard up. Louis Tiant, guy had a rubber arm, 160 pitch innings. Game he had in Game 4 of the 1975 World Series. He's number 3 on your list. Why isn't Louis talked about as much as he is today? The guy's a fantastic pitcher, for God's sakes.
I think we were talking about the Hall of Fame earlier. I think he certainly has the numbers to get in there. I know he's coming up for consideration with the committee that's voting. I guess before the end of the year. The Modern Era Committee. I know the Hall has different committees now to try and get players in who played in different eras, and he's one of the nominated. So I don't know. Hopefully, this time around they'll consider him more favorably. I write in the book that he's got the numbers right there with Drysdale and Bunning, who are very deserving Hall of Fame members. Tiant came up in 1964 with the Cleveland Indians. Talk about Marischal's stellar debut. July 1964, Tiant, first game in the major leagues. He starts against Whitey Ford at Yankee Stadium, and he shuts out the Yankees. So that was really a harbinger of greater things to come. He definitely, as you said, I rank him as the number 3 all-time greatest Hispanic pitcher, and he is just a credible guy to watch pitch. I was a teenager and I was able to see him in his glory with the Red Sox, and it was just a pleasure. And I hope one day soon he really gets the recognition he deserves.
And I loved Louis Tiant. I mean, the guy was so out of shape. How the heck did he pitch for so long?
I know. He was not your prototypical athlete. Usually only pitchers can get away with not having a great physique in baseball, and he fell into that category, certainly.
Not only that, but I love the cigars he used to smoke. You got a picture of him smoking with his hairy chest, his hairy belly? Look at him. That guy looks fantastic. That's the kind of guys I remember. Today you're all jacked up and stuff. I'll tell you one person I used to like a lot, Dennis Martinez. Let's talk about him.
Yeah, Dennis Martinez was a pitcher who had great staying power. He had a long career, and I think what the best way we can describe him as being a pitcher with consistency. He was a consistent pitcher, won double figures in wins, I don't know how many years in a row, and he put up really, if you examine him, he put up really crushing numbers. And when I say that, he is the all-time leader among Hispanic pitchers in games started. He started nearly he started 562 games. He appeared in almost 700. And he basically almost pitched 4,000 innings in his career, which is also a Hispanic record for pitchers. And he ended up, as I mentioned, topping Juan Marichal by 2 wins for the all-time Hispanic leader in wins, 245. He pitched with the Orioles. He came up with the Orioles. He was one of the first, in fact, the first pitcher from Nicaragua to appear in the major leagues. And his career with the Orioles sort of hit a snag there. He had arm trouble, didn't live up to prior pitching, and he ended up being traded to the Montreal Expos, where he resuscitated his career, and he became the first Hispanic pitcher to throw a perfect game with the Expos in 1981 at Dodger Stadium. So, he's consistency, crushing numbers, and he's number 7 on my list. I'm great.
Yeah, he's just fantastic. I used to love him, and the guy pitched consistently well into his early 40s. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to mention one last guy. I'd love to get to Mariano Rivera, Johan Santana, and Felix Hernandez, but I think they're so popularized these days that we can have another show on them when we talk about the history of the leagues. I am going to get to Fernando Mania because I want to just say something here. Fernando Valenzuela came up at a time where Los Angeles was growing. Okay, now Los Angeles people are leaving California, but at the time they surpassed Chicago as the number 2 city in the United States. You had a stellar Dodger team of the 1970s with some leftovers when Fernando came up in 1981. But the big thing was, to me, and it always has, yes, he had the popularity, like you mentioned in the book, of Mark Fidrich, the Bird, in Detroit. He had that kind of allure. Mexican kid, 28 years old. Again, strange wind-up. Where is he looking to the heavens? I have no idea. Maybe he's praying to God about in his wind-up. The whole thing was the Hispanic community in Los Angeles never forgave the Dodgers for the whole Chavez Ravine stuff. Fiasco. I don't like to say stuff. Fiasco, because although it was pretty much bare in the 1950s, they did have to evict families. And so racism will usually, rear its ugly head. Ricky, what was his name? Walter O'Malley, he just wanted a stadium to be put. Chavez Ravine was perfect. Unfortunately, had to go through 4 court cases, hearings, and then on nationally televised TV, see these families being carted away from Chavez Ravine. Let's talk about Fernando Mania and how that changed it.
Before I answer that, let me just say, I think I said Dennis Martinez threw his perfect game in 1981. It was actually 1991 at Dodger Stadium.
He was about 36 years old when he threw his
he was. He found great success later as a pitcher, probably because he just didn't throw hard, and that actually helped prolong his career.
And I liked him because he was a big lefty, and I loved those left-handed pitches, and Lord knows the Yankees could have needed that, in those years. But I like Dennis Martinez, and I always followed his career, and it was just a pleasure to see these guys pitch. Fernando, he came on the scene in 1981, the strike-shortened season. What's going on in Los Angeles here?
Well, as you mentioned, he certainly captivated not only the Hispanic base in Los Angeles and Southern California, but he ended up captivating the whole country with his pitching. It was so unique. He delivered the baseball. He had his big pitch was a screwball, and he just started the season just throwing shutout after shutout after shutout, and soon the whole country was trying to view this person, who this was, and find out more about him. And he just started off with a great career as far as wins. I think he won his first 10 decisions. First 8 in 1981. He had won 2 coming up the prior year, the September call-up. But he was certainly the Hispanic rookie that captured the most attention of probably any Hispanic rookie in baseball history. And he went to the post often, and he threw a lot of complete games, and he's really a Tommy Lasorda weapon, and helped the Dodgers beat the Yankees in that 81 series. That was sort of a kind of playoff there that was kind of skewered. Cincinnati got sort of jobbed there. They had the best record in the National League, but I don't think they even made the playoff with the two-split season system that they employed that year. And Valenzuela, I don't know how he beat the Yankees in the World Series game. I thought they had knocked him out in the second inning, I remember, but somehow he ended up pitching a 5-4 complete game, and it sort of propelled the Dodgers to the rest of the way, and they finally got over the hump. I know they had lost 2 series before to the Yankees in the late 70s. So he was a great pitcher. In fact, he might have gotten, because of his publicity, he might have gotten more credit than he deserved. I know, which is not to diminish his abilities, of course, and his influence and his impact on the game. But I know Major League Baseball at the end of the 20th century, they had an all-Hispanic player team, and Valenzuela was selected as the greatest left-handed pitcher. And really, he wasn't as far as Major League pitchers. Mike Cuellar had a better career and better numbers than Valenzuela, but because of his Valenzuela's notoriety and his fame gained in that market out there in L.A., he was named, which just a passing mention there. Great pitcher, had the numbers early in his career. Just went to the post a lot, and just any pitcher you would want on your team or as a teammate. I think any player would say that.
You know something? I think Morgana, the kissing bandit, I think she got a hold of Fernando that season, because she was popular running on the field, her boobs were bouncing up. I know she did that to Nolan Ryan and Greg Nettles. You just never knew where Morgana, the kissing bandit, was.
She was quite a character, definitely.
Oh, it's great stuff. Let me ask you something. Where do we find this fantastic book? I know I wanted to get to the whole book. We could spend another 3 hours talking because I just love this stuff. Where can we find the book? And, where could people just grab a copy for the holidays?
Yeah, as you mentioned, the publisher is McFarland Publishing Company. They're based in Jefferson, North Carolina. But I always tell people, as far as books are concerned, you can get them really at a good price through Amazon.com, and you get them fast as well. Online is the best place. I think you can get them at the regular Barnes & Noble online, too, if I'm not mistaken. But Amazon, I think, is your best bet.
Yeah, because it is published. It is published, and I do read the reviews of it. And, years ago, I think they reviewed more books than they do today. They just put them out and very few reviews. But again, excellent reviews. Go out and buy it. Lou, it's always a pleasure to speak to you. Hold the line. This is how I end it. Folks, go out and get this book. You're going to want to read about, origins of the Hispanic pitchers, origins of the Hispanic League. Very important. See the influx of, global baseball today. These Latin American players that had such a huge impact on the game. It's a fun read. It's a good lesson. You'll learn a lot. Go out, get the book. As always, I'm Ian Kahanowitz. Thank you, Lou Hernandez, for being on the show. And signing off on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network and in the immortal words of Edward Almaro. Good night, folks. Good luck. We'll see you next time.